Good afternoon. We're here to conduct a study session on a survey of breed-specific language of 22 cities that have repealed their ordinances. And I will turn it over to the city manager to get us started.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm sure you recall, you tasked staff with looking into this, and the conversation was to the extent what it was that you wanted from staff, and so the instructions were pretty specific in that you wanted us to survey the communities in Kansas that had repealed the pit bull ban and see what their reaction was or what feedback they had about their experiences. Sean Hennessy, Assistant City Manager, developed a set of questions, and I'll let him kind of present, but developed kind of a survey instrument that he was able to reach out to those communities. We have scheduled 30 minutes for the study session. I think the questions and the responses are pretty straightforward. You've had an opportunity to look at those, so I don't know that we need to dwell on those a great deal, but we'll give Sean an opportunity to walk you through those, and then I'll leave you some time to discuss or provide additional direction. So.
Thank you, Commissioners. Sean Hennessy, Assistant City Manager. Go ahead and go to the next one. So here, just quickly, a brief introduction, some of the caveats. I want to give you some background, then we'll get into the responses that we received, and then overview and give you an opportunity for some questions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to cover several of these different points early because probably the number one point is this is not a scientific survey by any stretch of the imagination. As indicated by the city manager, what we did was we reached out to those communities we were able to identify in the state of Kansas that had repealed BSL, and to get an idea of what their experiences have been, and also to get an idea of what additional steps, if any, they'd undertaken as part of that repeal. While 22 different cities were surveyed, many did not respond, and some of those that did respond only partially responded because, well, for a variety of reasons, they didn't have their own animal shelter or other, so they weren't comfortable with answering that question. And it's also important to note that this is a survey based upon, contacting individual cities, asking them these series of questions, but we have no idea the person who's responding to this, are they pro-BSL, anti-BSL repeal, any of those things. So again, this is not a scientific survey, but it is to give you an idea in those cases, some of the responses we've got. As I mentioned before, many of these communities, particularly the smaller ones, don't maintain a shelter, and they contract with others for animal housing with larger cities, so they felt that they couldn't answer some of these questions. And again, the feedback is largely anecdotal, but I wanted to go over those key points. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So here are the 22 cities that we surveyed. You see them all right there. These range in size from obviously the largest being as far as a city being Overland Park, and then you've got some very small cities, Altamont and otherwise. You'll also see additionally 3 cities down here in the lower right corner. These were not part of the survey. These were additional cities that have repealed BSL, and that was after the survey was already underway. And in fact, Russell is another one that is in that. So technically there would be 26 cities that we've been able to identify that have repealed BSL. However, only 22 of those had the questions submitted to them for the survey. There is no real clear-cut result from the survey. I think that, and again, this survey is not advocating one way or the other. It's just to present information to the City Commission. We did limit the survey to only Kansas cities. As part of doing this research, we did run into other cities that have repealed BSL. Some of them quite large. Denver and Springfield, Missouri have both repealed BSL, but we really wanted to focus this on Kansas cities and communities, and so that's what this was really focused on. And again, because some of these cities were very small, I anticipated it would be difficult to get responses from them because with the small cities, they're responsible for multiple different areas. They may not have enough time to get back to it. So being able to get roughly half of the surveys back was actually a little bit better than I was anticipating. Go ahead and get into the surveys. Question number one is, since the ban was lifted, the number of pit bulls in the shelter has either increased, decreased, or stayed the same. And as you can see here, this is one which is pretty strongly, it pretty much stayed the same. There was one community that said that it increased, and I believe that was Junction City. I'll have to go back and make my notes to that, although they, as we'll get into some of the later questions, they felt that overall it had been a positive for repeal. So again, what you'll see is there's no, every city is unique in their aspects, the way they've applied this, the impact it has been on it, so I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all to any of these questions or responses. And every one of these questions was since the ban was lifted. I didn't want to bore you all with repetition, so question two would be really since the ban was lifted, the number of pit bulls in your area has. Every one of these questions were basically prefaced by that, unless the question is otherwise formatted. So question number two, since the ban was lifted, the number of pit bulls in your area has increased, decreased, or stayed the same. So we had 4 that increased, none that said that it decreased, and 6 that it stayed the same. This could be, again, there's a wide variety of reasons. While, yes, the pit bull ban has been lifted, some communities adopted some restrictions on them, which may have kept as many people from getting additional pit bulls. In some communities, there was a pit bull ban in place, but it was not very rigorously enforced, so there may not have been as much of an increase in the number of pit bulls afterwards. So again, it's kind of hit and miss as far as the impact of the communities. But as you can see, nowhere did anyone say it decreased. It either increased or stayed the same. The number of bites involving pit bulls in the area since the ban has been lifted, 3 said that it's increased, 1 said it's decreased, and 6 said that it stayed the same. In the decrease category, there was a feeling that because we adopted these additional standards, that we were actually able to promote better pit bull ownership, and that's how they felt they were able to see a decrease, even though pit bulls were no longer banned within that community. However, other communities did see an increase since the pit bull ban was lifted, and 6 respondees said that it stayed the same. I will tell you again, we were only able to find one community that actually kept track exactly by specific breed and was able to relay that to us. And most of the other communities, this was purely anecdotal information, but this would be people who would be responsible for this in their own individual city for keeping track of this. So any additional complications since the repeal? Yes, 3 said, an additional 7 said no. Some of those complications have been an increase in the number of bites by pit bulls since it was lifted, but bites by other breeds had also increased, and that was in Junction City. So while they'd seen an increase in the number of bites by pit bulls since the ban had lifted, they had also seen an increase in the number of bites by other dogs overall. In some cities relayed that they felt that they saw a decrease in the number of bites since the ban was lifted, and that'd be Overland Park. They were a community that felt that because they had placed additional restrictions on it, they were actually able to decrease the number of bites. Other factors or complications are during COVID, there was a large number of animals that were adopted. This is what was relayed to us as part of the survey. So post-COVID era, there's been, in some communities, a large influx of animals. Again, in other communities, they didn't see that. Every community is different in terms of the impact that COVID had on them and their animal shelter and the number of animals that were present there. And so the conditions were highly varied. Question 5 was, since the repeal of the ban, is the amount of time focused on pit bulls, has it increased, decreased, or stayed the same? Again, this answer was pretty strong overall. There was one that did feel it was increased because they felt that there was additional enforcement had to take place in regards to pit bulls, although the other 9 respondents felt that it either decreased or stayed the same. This is because staff time isn't spent as much as far as classification of the animals and otherwise. So they felt that overall the amount of staff time focused on pit bulls had decreased since the repeal of the pit bull ban. Question number 6, since the repeal of the ban, the adoption process for pit bulls is easier or stayed the same, and no community was it harder. That's not a very surprising answer, since these are all communities that had repealed the ban. So they felt that the many communities, they just basically removed all of the BSL language. Other communities adopted additional restrictions on BSL, which may have required the adoption process to be more drawn out. There had to be neuterings or licenses, or there's a wide variety of different steps that cities had undertaken as part of their BSL repeals, and we can talk about that. Other factors in the adoption process, while lifting the bans mean more animals can be adopted, there are also more animals up for adoption. So it's kind of like what we see in the city of Salina is we have a large number of pit bulls typically in our shelter, but they cannot be adopted out, so we're trying to place them in other communities and localities. What other communities have seen is when they've repealed the ban, they have seen an increase in the number of pit bulls, but then they've been able to process them out, if you will, a little bit easier because they're able to adopt them in the local community. Other communities don't have the same results. It really varies from community to community. I had at least one community say that because their ban was not vigorously enforced, they felt that there really hadn't been any change in the overall number of pit bulls in their community. So obviously you didn't see a big change in their overall process because of that. Some cities require additional steps for an adoption. This can be microchipping, requiring a license. Some cities, Wichita does not have a pit bull ban. They do have restrictions on pit bull, limiting the number in a single home. Some cities take a step which would be difficult to enforce, and from a staffing perspective, of restricting drug offenders from having pit bulls. Many of the cities that have lifted the ban have not adapted these additional requirements. I would say probably 2/3 roughly of the cities did not adopt additional requirements, but a number of other cities did adopt these additional requirements as part of their repeal process. Since the ban was lifted, was the overall impact to the local community? It's been 2 felt it was positive, 2 felt it was negative, and 5 felt that it stayed the same. So again, it really is across the board in terms of what the communities that were surveyed felt like the overall impact of the lifting of the ban was. 3 responded affirmatively that penalties were increased, and 4 said that no, that they did not increase any penalties. This is distinct from some of the restrictions that may be in place. This would be penalties for animals that were found to be either dangerous or who had other issues as far as the penalties are assessed for their behavior. Some of the other steps cities have undertaken, as I mentioned, the city of Wichita does not have a ban but requires microchipping. Several of the cities that have taken other steps is rather than having breed-specific legislation, they've adopted kind of under an umbrella a dangerous dog ordinance, which is essentially agnostic when it comes to breeds, but requires additional steps have to be taken when animals take bites or have other, shall we say, antisocial tendencies. There's microchipping, again, with the priors with drug felonies. Interesting, Junction City also adopted an ordinance that basically increased the penalties for false reporting an animal as a service animal. Their fear there was they were afraid that people would attempt to go over the limits that they had imposed by stating that they were service animals, so they adopted an additional penalty in regards to that. PETA has generally been in favor and support of BSL and pit bull bans. However, they did say that indicated that if there is a repeal, that they recommend that a community require that the pit bulls be spayed and neutered, prohibit dog chaining and caging, and require that owners keep pit bulls indoors unless they're being walked with a leash or something else. So that's kind of their stance when it comes to BSL and repeal. I do want to thank Holly McGinnis in the city manager's office for doing a lot of the grunt work on this for the survey. It does take quite a bit of time and follow up because, again, you're trying to track down a lot of different people and trying to get the information from them and trying to find somebody who can respond. The survey results, as you can see, are kind of all over the board. There is really no clear-cut answers. I think that overall, the one that was the strongest was the repeal of a pit bull ban. It was almost unanimous. It does result in less staff time, but that may not be the case if there are additional restrictions are in place that have to be enforced. And communities differ wildly in their experience with pit bull bans. So that's the sum total of the survey. I want to try to keep this fairly brief so you would have plenty of opportunity for questions or anything else. So.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessy, and thank you, Holly. You know, it sounds to me like cities that have repealed the bans and modified them, it's been fairly uneventful. And my thought is that our ban is not really accomplishing anything, and that we're just harboring these dogs and feeding and cleaning up after them forever, and I don't think it's fair to the dogs or the staff. So I would be in favor of us as a commission making some modifications, so I will open it up for questions.
Before we jump that far down the road, I don't think you can take these results and say it's been uneventful. Is this on? Yeah, these results, you know, we don't have, did we have numbers? You know, if a city had one bite in 2 years, and they still have just one bite in 2 years, then their appropriate answer is no change.
We only had one city that was able to give us actual hard numbers, and they were, I could certainly provide those to you. It was Junction City. It was, if I remember rightly, it was, yes, their number of pit bull bites had increased, but their overall number of bites had also increased. Junction City also went through a lot of changes in regards to they used to have a 15-dog limit, which was, to me, extremely high on individual homes, and they went to a 6-dog limit. And so they went through a number of changes in addition to repealing BSL. In some ways, they adopted some other restrictions in the city, and that was all fairly recently.
All right, because question number 3, you know, 3 of the cities noted increased number of bites, and I think what we're going to get judged by is those 1 or 2 bites that cause harm to this poor little innocent kid. You know, the statistics fly out the window real quick when you have a sentimental case like that. But I did have some questions about this. Do the cities in Kansas, from what you gathered from this, have a universally accepted method of identifying a dog as a pit bull? Or were you able to?
I actually did not research that the way it is done, so I can't give you an answer on that. I did not run across that in the survey, but frankly, I did not research that topic.
Because I noticed the cities that put other restrictions on pit bulls, and even the PETA recommendations, are based on being able to identify the dog as a pit bull, which gets us right back to where we are now. Yeah.
That's happened in a number of jurisdictions. I think it's still probably over half did not do that. They just did a repeal. However, a lot of the jurisdictions did adopt, or they already had restrictions on pit bulls. Like I said, the city of Wichita does not have a pit bull ban, but they do have restrictions, pretty strict restrictions overall on the number of pit bulls. So yes, a number of communities have adopted restrictions in accordance with a repeal of pit bull bans. And one point, just to make sure, I did not run across any cities in the city of Kansas. I can't 100% guarantee you that no cities have actually had a vote on this, but these were all decisions, as far as I was able to tell, by the local governing board. Now, there was a BSL repeal in both Denver and a BSL repeal in Liberty, Missouri that was voted on by the population. It barely passed the repeal in Liberty. It passed by 64% in Denver, although Denver did maintain some restrictions afterwards. So again, I really was focused on Kansas, so I didn't get, but I did want to relay that to you. So.
Brings up one of our issues here has been, do we use genetic testing, or is it, or something more reliable than just looking at the dog? I'm just wondering how these other cities were enforcing it. I'm assuming they're all reactive, complaint-driven enforcement rather than going out looking for these dogs.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're again, every community is going to be different. I do understand that, and again, I did not do this as part of the survey. One of the concerns about using genetic testing is being able to keep the chain of evidence custody in place, so that adds to an additional cost and expense and time. So that's one of the reasons why several communities have not been able to go forward with that, but I don't know what the actual numbers are or the methods that they use.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, again, I'm going to take the hard line, and I don't see anything on here that makes me want to change my mind. I guess I'm going to have to ask Mayor Longbein what his ideas of modification are. But before we do that, you talked about the two cities that have had it voted on. What would it take? Because from what I understand as a commission, we cannot put an item like that on the ballot ourselves. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, as far as a recommendation, there is the ability, and I haven't really extensively researched, but I do know that there is a possibility that an ordinance could be submitted. That would be an ordinance for repeal, which could be submitted. What the City Commission cannot do is ask for essentially an advisory vote. That is one thing that the Kansas does not allow, is advisory votes. So you can get, and this is just my general legal knowledge, as lacking as it may be in Kansas, is there is the ability through either the petition process, which is outside, then that would come to the City Commission, and you could either vote to approve it, or you could then say it goes to a vote, or you could initiate a vote on a repeal of an ordinance if that was the process that you wanted to take. But you cannot do an advisory opinion.
Yeah, I mean, my stance is, we've had the BSL in place. We've had no issues with, pit bull bites and stuff, and I'm not one to repeal it myself and have to go to a family and apologize for something happened. I guess if somebody's able to put a petition together and put it to vote, and it becomes the vote of the city to change that, so be it. But I'm not going to do it while I'm sitting up here. At least that's going to be my vote at this point. I guess one other question is, do we know how many other communities in the state of Kansas have some type of BSL?
Yes, I thought that question might come up. I can't give you an exact number because it changes. It is roughly right now about 55 cities. If you look, there are several websites that keep track of And actually, they do a pretty good job. They keep track of, and you're able to click on the ordinance and everything else. And if you look at that, you'll see about 63 cities still have a BSL prohibition in place. However, at least those 4 cities that were up there have repealed that, and a number of those other cities had bans in place, but they hadn't been able to verify it. So I would say roughly 55 to 60 cities in the state of Kansas still have a BSL prohibition, and then you have these cities that we just talked about, the 26th, which have repealed it, although they may have added additional restrictions as part of that repeal.
Thank you.
So these would be smaller cities and towns, you think?
Well, if you look at the chart, I guess a lot of it just depends on how you define small. Some of them, population-wise, Greensburg's only 700, et cetera. Although the largest cities are by far all of, Wyandotte County and the city of Overland Park. Additionally, you have several cities in the 20+ thousand range, which is Junction City and Liberal. I think Liberal's right at 20,000 now. But you'll also see most of the repeals have occurred, I would say, roughly since 2018. There has been some in 2007, 2008, but most of the repeals have occurred since 2018. And it's interesting, and again, I was focused just on Kansas. So in Denver's vote, they voted 64% to repeal the BSL, but yet in 2014 in Aurora, which is a suburb of Denver, they voted 64% to keep the BSL in place in the past. So again, those are rather large neighboring cities with different approaches. Then later, the city of Aurora decided to repeal the BSL ban, was taken to court and found that they couldn't basically ignore the vote to keep the ban in place, so the ban was then reinstated by the court. So again, that kind of gives you an idea that it's kind of all over the place, and those are 2 large cities adjoining one another.
Okay, well, we are out of time. So I suspect this conversation will continue somewhere down the road, and there's all kinds of mixed thoughts and opinions, and maybe that is the answer, to let the people decide. So we will see you back here at 4 o'clock.